Greetings and welcome to Jots and Tittles. This is a short form podcast. I'm Jeff Riddle. I'm the pastor of Christ Reformed Baptist Church in Louisa, Virginia. In this episode, I want to do just a brief follow-up to a podcast that I did recently. It was Word Magazine number 256, in which I reviewed a sermon on the pericope adulteri, the woman taken in adultery, John 7:53 through 8:11. Interestingly enough, this was a sermon that was preached at an ordination service for a Presbyterian minister. It was preached by Zach Keel, who's from California. The ordination service was in Wisconsin. And as a follow-up to that, I recently ran across another sermon that was preached on John 7:53 through 8:11, the pericope adulteri, the woman taken in adultery. And this was from a liberal mainline minister from the Church of England, actually, and it was done at Yale Divinity School. But I thought it was an interesting contrast because even though this was a sermon from a liberal minister in a liberal divinity school, he actually affirms in the end the authenticity of the woman taken in adultery. And I thought it was a kind of an interesting contrast where the conservative evangelical rejects the authenticity of the woman taken in adultery, while this liberal mainline Protestant was affirming it. So anyways, I want to just play a very brief clip from the sermon in which he discusses very briefly issues related to textual controversy over the woman taken in adultery. And so this is a sermon by a fellow named Brian Spinks. And according to the description there on the YouTube channel, he was the Bishop F. Percy Goddard Professor of Liturgical Studies and Pastoral Theology at Yale Divinity School in New Haven, Connecticut. And the service in which this sermon was given was a chapel service at the Yale Divinity School in the Marquand, I don't know how you pronounce it, but Marquand, Marquand Chapel. The sermon was preached in March of 2010, although this video wasn't posted to YouTube till sometime in 2022. And it's interesting, you'll see it's obviously more of a high church type service. This was a sermon that was given in a service that was titled West Meets East. And it was an attempt in this liberal divinity school to combine Anglican or Western elements with Eastern church elements. And so you've got Mr. Spinks, who's there representing Anglicanism in the West. And this was a service in which there were some participants from Eastern Orthodox communions. There was someone from the Syrian Orthodox and the Maronite churches, I think, or they were combining elements of the Eastern liturgies. So it's kind of a strange hodgepodge that was taking place. But again, the thing that I was interested in was the fact that he was preaching on the woman taken in adultery. So again, I just want to play a very brief clip. He says some things that I think are wrong about the woman taken in adultery, but in the end, I was actually encouraged by the fact that even this liberal Anglican saw the value of affirming the authenticity of a woman taken in adultery. So let me see if we can bring up the screen here. And you can see now we're in the chapel at Yale Divinity School. And we have Mr. Spinks, who is there at the pulpit or the lectern. And again, I just want to listen to a few things that he has to say in this part of his presentation or homily about the controversy about the woman taken in adultery passage. So let's listen to it.
But of course, with the delights of theology, I discovered the curious nature of the narrative of the woman caught in adultery. Namely, that it doesn't occur in many manuscripts of St. John, and for that reason, many of the Greek fathers are silent on it in their commentaries.
Okay, so he says, he's in the midst of giving this sermon or homily. He says it's not there in many Greek manuscripts. Many of the Greek fathers are silent about it. We sort of talked about this in the review of Zach Keel's sermon. It actually is, of course, in the majority of extant manuscripts. And although there are some Greek fathers who are silent on it, there are early Greek fathers like Didymus the Blind, who makes reference to this passage in his commentary on Ecclesiastes. And of course, in the Western Church, there are many early patristic references, and he's even going to cite the reference in Augustine. But anyways, he acknowledges that there are some textual issues with John 7:53 through 8:11.
And in some manuscripts, it comes not in chapter 8, but at the end. And in some manuscripts, it is placed in St. Luke's Gospel. It is a floating tradition, and so some have decided that it is not authentic.
Okay, now, he repeats this often stated observation about the woman taken in adultery, that it is found in different places in some manuscripts, and it is a so-called floating tradition. And he sort of presents that as this is just the facts of what the status of this passage is. And I'm really doubtful that he probably I don't want to be offensive. I don't want to be uncharitable. I'm really doubtful that he probably knows that much about it. As we sort of pointed out with Zach Keel, we often hear people make statements about the woman taken in adultery, and a lot of times they're dependent largely upon secondary literature. Is it proper to call the woman taken in adultery a so-called floating tradition? A lot of people, I think of this man's generation, Mr. Spinks's generation, they were dependent upon Bruce Metzger. And in Bruce Metzger's textual commentary on the New Testament, he does discuss the fact that the pericope adulterae in some isolated manuscripts occurs in different places. So let me just read this little section from Metzger's commentary. He says, others placed it after chapter 7, verse 36, but he only lists one manuscript, and it's a late minuscule 225, or after chapter 7, verse 44. And here he doesn't list any Greek manuscripts, but he mentions only several Georgian manuscripts. So there are no Greek manuscripts that put it after 744. Or after chapter 21, verse 25. That would be at the end of the Gospel of John. And here he notes a handful of minuscule manuscripts that are by and large late medieval. They include 565, 1076, 1570, 1582, and also some Armenian manuscripts. We know that this passage was not part of the read in the liturgy, so it's not part of those collections of gospel readings that were used liturgically within the church, and this probably led in these later minuscule manuscripts to it perhaps being dislodged in some of them. He says, or after, this is returning to Metzger, or after Luke 21:38. And here he mentions that this occurs in family 13. So family 13 refers to a group of manuscripts, minuscule manuscripts of the New Testament that have some similarity to one another. Let me just read briefly the section on the family 13 grouping of manuscripts. I'm reading from Bruce Metzger and Bart Ehrman's fourth edition of the text of the New Testament, subtitled Its Transmission, Corruption, and Restoration. It says of family 13, in 1868, a professor of Latin at Dublin University, William Hugh Farrar, discovered that 4 medieval manuscripts, namely 1369, 124, and 346, were closely related textually. His collations were published posthumously in 1877 by his friend and colleague T.K. Abbott. It is known today that this group, the so-called Farrar group, comprises about a dozen members, including manuscripts 230, 543, 788, 826, 983, 1689, and 1709. They were copied between the 11th and 15th centuries and are descendants of an archetype that came either from Calabria in southern Italy or from Sicily. One of the noteworthy features of these manuscripts is that they have the section about the adulterous woman, John 7:53 through 8:11, not in the fourth gospel, but after Luke 21:38. Like family 1, this family also has affinities with the Caesarean type of text. So there were these 4 manuscripts that William Hugh Farrar grouped together, and one of their commonalities was that they took John 7:53 through 8:11 and they put it after Luke 21 verse 38, and then they discovered a few other manuscripts that were similar, and all of these though come from between the 11th and the 15th centuries. None of them are early, and most likely the displacement of the Pericope Adulterae in these manuscripts is due to the fact that it was not in the liturgical readings, and for that reason it came to be displaced. But there's no early evidence of any displacement. The vast majority of extant manuscripts of the Gospel of John have the woman taken in adultery exactly where it appears in our modern translations today at John 7:53 through 8:11. That is, after John 7:52 and before John 8:12. And rather than dismiss the Pericope Adulterae as a so-called floating tradition, I've made the suggestion many times before that people would read the scholarly article written by Chris Keith, who is not a supporter of the TR, but a mainstream sort of modern evangelical textual critic. But he has studied the Pericope Adulterae, and he has penned an article back in 2009 that was titled "The Initial Location of the the Pericope Adulterae in Fourfold Tradition." It was in a respected scholarly journal, the Novum Testamentum, volume 51, again, 2009, pages 1 through 23. And here's what he says as part of the conclusion of that article. He said, quote, "There is no extant evidence that the Pericope Adulterae was read in a canonical gospel text in any location other than John 7:53 through 8:11 until the late 9th or 10th century CE." End of that quote. So it's only in a handful of these later manuscripts that probably, like Family 13, came from the same archetype. It's not really 12 witnesses, but really one witness, all following one earlier archetype. They're all later. All of the early manuscripts that we have that contain John 7:53 through 8:11 have it in the traditional location where we know it today. So anyways, so you might say, well, Jeff, how can you say that Spinks here is doing something that we can approve of because he has bought into the Pericope Adulterae is a floating tradition? But again, let's hear him out. Although he says that it was a floating tradition, and he doesn't acknowledge the fact that the places where it appears late are all again late minuscule manuscripts, and he doesn't countenance the fact that this was likely influenced by the fact that the passage was not read in the liturgy, and therefore in the various lectionary texts it perhaps was omitted, and that led to some people making mistakes in the transcription of manuscripts of John, and maybe trying to figure out where to place it, because it didn't appear in the lectionary texts. So anyways, so he says this. Let's listen to the rest of his brief comments now, continuing to talk about controversy over this passage and see where he ends up with his conclusions.
But like many other preachers, I find this so compellingly messianic and so Jesus-like that I find no good reason not to accept its authenticity.
This is strange, though. He's listened to Metzger. He's read the people who have cast doubt upon the passage, but to use his language here, he says he finds it so compellingly messianic and so Jesus-like, there's no compelling reason to reject its authenticity. He's got just a little bit more to say, and then we'll pause.
Yet this reading rarely appears with any frequency in lectionaries. St. Augustine wrote that often these verses were being left out by some, lest their wives should be given impunity in sinning, though I think that tells us more about clergy than clergy wives.
I don't think Augustine said anything about this relating to clergy wives, but anyways, at least here, Mr. Spinks is making reference to the fact that Augustine, in writing about the year 400, not only makes reference to the woman taken in adultery, but he also describes how in his times there were people who were trying to remove the passage because they were offended by what they perceived to be the ethics here. They didn't approve of Jesus offering forgiveness for the adulterous woman. So they were rigorous legalists of some sort, who didn't think that Christ's forgiveness of the woman taken in adultery was appropriate ethically for Christians. And anyways, doesn't say anything about this being about clergy wives, but about wives of Christians in general. That Augustine says the people who wanted to remove this passage thought it might embolden Christian wives to engage in adultery because they could then, I guess, appeal to cheap grace and quickly be forgiven. So anyways, so at the least, Spinks here, he acknowledged it's missing from the lectionaries, and although he doesn't make the connection that that's why it's missing in some later medieval manuscripts, and he notes that it was cited by Augustine, and he notes that Augustine acknowledged that there were people trying to remove it in his day for ethical reasons, I guess we could say.
But this account is in the Textus Receptus of the canon and commands our utmost attention.
But this passage is in the Textus Receptus of the canon, and it deserves our utmost attention. And so that's going to be the extent of the clip that I'm going to show. I'll put a link when I post this video. I'll do an article on my blog at jeffriddle.net, and I'll put a link there to the entire service if you want to watch the entire East meets West Chapel service from 2010 at Yale Divinity School. And if you want to listen to the entire message, it's sort of a typical message, I think, that you'd find in many sort of mainline Protestant seminaries. Obviously it appeals to the passage because it's very much about grace and forgiveness. There's very little talk about wrath, the wrath of God in many of these mainline churches. But anyways, I did think it was very interesting, though, that even this mainline Protestant minister can say that the pericope adulterae is part of the received text, and it's the canonical text. Maybe he's been influenced by Brevard Childs, but isn't it interesting that he sort of does what some of our fellow evangelicals say you shouldn't do, and that is that you shouldn't consider the canonical issues related to text. that canon isn't just a matter of books, but it's also a matter of the text. And he's saying this passage, though there's controversy about it, has been received by Christians down through the ages as part of the canonical text of the Gospel of John. So again, I just wanted to share this. I thought it was interesting. Even a mainline Anglican demonstrates respect and acceptance of the woman taken in adultery passage. And again, I thought this was an interesting contrast to the Zach Keel sermon, where a reformed evangelical conservative, otherwise conservative person rejects the authenticity of the woman taken in adultery. It's also interesting that he chose this to preach upon in a service where they were trying to combine Western and Eastern aspects of liturgy. And that's interesting because maybe it was a fitting choice of a passage, because the woman taken in adultery historically was accepted in both the West and in the East. And so it's there in the Protestant Textus Receptus. It was there in the Latin Vulgate. And it was there in the majority Byzantine manuscripts. And it's there in the Orthodox Patriarchal Text of 1904. It seems that only a rather small group of liberal Protestants of the 19th, 20th, and on into the 21st century, and now some broad evangelicals are the only ones who reject the authenticity of the woman taken in adultery. So anyways, I know this is a little different type of clip to show, but I did think it was a very interesting counterpoint to see acceptance of the Textus Receptus in the chapel at Yale Divinity School, while it would be rejected, sadly, in the chapels of many evangelical and even reformed seminaries today. Well, with that, I'm going to bring this episode of Jots and Tittles to an end. I hope this has been helpful and interesting, encouraging to those who are listening. And I'll look forward to speaking to you in the next episode of Jots and Tittles. Till then, take care and God bless.